Thanks very much indeed. That was fascinating. And now to our final speaker in this section. Dr. Andrew Blowers is Emeritus Professor at the Open University on radioactive waste matters, and he is author of The Legacy of Nuclear Power. Over to you, Andrew.
My slides on, please. Thank you. Can somebody take this? Thank you very much indeed for this conference. And I would start by saying that much of the debate about nuclear energy seems to me to be conducted at the strategic, national, and on the whole economic level. But it also affects communities and people, and I want to focus today, or our attention, on the implications for localities and communities, because that is a major issue, and I think in terms of the current debates tends to be being neglected. And I speak from the perspective of someone who's worked both at national level and local level in local government and with government committees and so on, and I currently lead a campaign group called BANG, which is Blackwater Against New Nuclear Group. I hope you'll try and join us before the day is out. And this is opposing the proposed Chinese investment into nuclear reactors in Essex on the Blackwater estuary. So I do tend to look at this both from a national and a local perspective. And I've called this talk The Legacy of Nuclear Power, which follows a book that I've just published. And if anybody's interested in that book, there are leaflets at the back on the outside desk, which will draw your attention to it. Nuclear power, I think we all have concluded, at least in the West, is on the wane, even in the United Kingdom. But nuclear power takes a long time to depart. And it is a long, lingering and painful process, and I think most of us do not know what is ultimately going to happen. It is shored up still, especially in the UK, by a coalition of interests. Political interests, labour interests, by which I mean workers, the scientific community, the nuclear community, and above all, perhaps, the military community. And it is uncertain how long and where it will actually end. In brief, what's wrong with nuclear power? I can tick these things off very quickly because there will no doubt be recurrent themes of the day. First of all, it is insecure. Quite aside from the idea that somehow this is a secure form of energy, it's dependent on foreign investment. It is linked to the military. There are dangers of proliferation and diversion, terrorist attacks and so on, and accidents which are recurrent and which are, as Charles Perrow long ago said, normal events. We should not think that somehow a Fukushima is exceptional. Every generation, at least, we have a major event with catastrophic consequences, and they are, one might argue, statistically and empirically, an inevitability. They're not something that doesn't happen. So it's insecure, it's unsafe. The health risks have been already alluded to, and although there is contention over this, I think the conclusion is that it does have health impacts, and these impacts, and indeed the impacts we've just learned about on plants and animals to the environment, are very important. So it is unsafe. It is an inflexible form of power, in the sense that the idea that somehow this keeps the lights on as part of the energy mix is faintly risible. I mean, when do the lights actually go off? And if they do, it's more likely to be as a result of the failure of nuclear power, as happened in Japan, than it is over other matters. So it is very inflexible, and if it develops, it is unreliable. There is a lock-in, and we could get to the situation where we have nuclear power competing against renewables and which is going to have to give way? Probably renewables, because of the built-in prices and so on that are there with nuclear power. It is frankly an economic disaster area. And lastly, it's unsustainable. There is an environmental problem with nuclear energy, which is often compared. It's seen as a solution, would you believe, to climate change. We've got to save the planet. The argument of the nuke people is, therefore, we've got to have nuclear energy, because it is a low-carbon form of energy, and it will give us baseload power and so on. Both those arguments, I think, are bogus, but especially the argument about somehow nuclear energy is a difficult thing to have, but it is for a greater global benefit. Because actually, nuclear energy, if you think about it, nuclear power, is connected to weapons. And obviously, we're at the CND conference today, and let's not forget that link as we proceed. You have such things as accidents, the bomb, and indeed things like Fukushima and Chernobyl, which give a dimension to nuclear power energy which is potentially catastrophic. And if it does happen, of course, it would happen at once and would have immense impacts, regional, possibly global. And climate change is a slowly developing process. The catastrophe of nuclear energy can be immediate. And therefore, I would say it is a moral issue in its own right. We should not see it as somehow a moral conscience saving us from the world, because it is powerful enough to destroy the world and therefore is itself a major moral issue. And I ask you to forget these arguments about it being a solution to climate change. So what is this legacy I'm talking about? Well, first of all, it's a physical legacy. It's fairly obvious, I think. It's in the buildings, in contamination, in wastes, in wastelands that have developed across the world. And a lot of this legacy arises through routine, but also accidental and deliberate activities. And it creates what I would call landscapes of risk. And it is not simply, and it also has around it communities and people. So it's not just a physical legacy, it is a social legacy. And we need to focus on that, because that seems to me pretty well the terminal argument against nuclear energy. Now, if I can have my sequence of slides. The next one, please. So I want to talk first about one nuclear landscape that I know particularly well, which is Hanford in the northwest of the United States. It is a huge reservoir, a huge reservation, the size of Bedfordshire and bigger, half the size of Rhode Island. Absolutely massive, in a bend in the Columbia River in the eastern part of Washington state. And its history is, it was part of the Manhattan Project, one of the 3 sites which developed nuclear weapons during the war. In fact, Hanford was responsible for the development and production of plutonium. That was the plutonium base both during the war and during the Cold War in the United States. So that is the plants that were being developed during wartime. 50,000 people were on that site, and it was there for 2.5 years to develop the bomb, which eventually, of course, had catastrophic effects in 1945. But it was almost a heroic movement of assembling that number of people, that kind of technology, etc., on that site. Those were the sort of barrack-like accommodation in which people lived, segregated on the side of the Columbia River there. Absolutely colossal, transforming what was a semi-desert area pretty well overnight in a massive logistical operation. But what was it doing? It was producing Fat Man. Fat Man was the bomb which ultimately was set on Nagasaki. The second of the bombs was the plutonium bomb. And this is a not particularly easy photograph to see, but that is of the devastation of Nagasaki in August 1945, pretty well at the termination of the Second World War. And this was how it was heralded in Hanford, which became a sort of almost heroic site. It was our bombs. It is atomic bombs. They had no idea what they had been doing until it was revealed on that day by President Roosevelt. And as somebody put it to me, you can never feel that proud again. That was the kind of emphasis that were coming out of that production period. Since then, there's been the Cold War, and a massive legacy has been left. It was stuff was just tipped around, flown over and sprayed from the air and so on in a most calamitous way in the 2-3 decades after the war, during the arms race with the USSR. And so Hanford has been left with a contaminated landscape and with a massive cleanup operation. This is the legacy of nuclear energy. It is not something that's here today, gone tomorrow. It goes on for generations. And these are some of the efforts at dealing with the Hanford issue. I quickly show you Chernobyl. This is the deserted town there, and also here's another picture of the Fukushima accident, to demonstrate that there are landscapes of risk. I mean, Hanford is almost a deliberate one. These are those that have arisen as a result of accidents. Coming to a more familiar area, Sellafield. Sellafield also has massive legacy on a much more compressed site, only 2 square miles, but loads of facilities at Sellafield, and we know that it is one of the most contaminated and dangerous places in Western Europe. This is just one picture of one of the ponds in which stuff was dumped immediately after the war as Sellafield was being developed, which has left them with an immensely difficult problem of cleanup, and therefore Sellafield remains and will remain for probably decades to come the central physical problem in the United Kingdom. We should not forget that when we are talking about new developments and so on. Sellafield is the issue here and now, and cleanup is the big problem. Very briefly, I move now to Gorleben in Germany, and you'll see in the woods there, the River Elbe to the north, there is both a salt mine headworks on the right and an intermediate level and a store for high-level wastes and a conversion centre on the left. But that is not completed, it's been stopped. And although the nuclear industry has put its imprint on Gorleben, which is the totemic site in Germany, that is the area over which there has been struggle for 30 to 40 years. And as a result of that struggle, in the end, Gorleben no longer is taking casks, the big Castor casks from France and other places, and no longer is the mine being developed as a potential laboratory and repository. Okay. Yes, okay, I got that. So what we have is these communities are on the periphery. They are, the communities I'm talking about are places that are remote, they're economically marginal, politically powerless, and also environmental risk. They are places that are vulnerable. And they are places that are there and will stay there by a process of what I call peripheralization. There are power relations which mean that they attract and at the same time repel, and other places will not take it. So we do have nuclear landscapes now with communities around them that are not likely to change in the future. And that brings about an intergenerational impact. This goes on down the generations. And the problem we have in our society is, what do we do about the nuclear waste that we currently have? It is an almost unmanageable situation, but we know we have to manage it. And at the moment, the only way we can manage it is to have it stored safely as possible and to keep on renewing the stores, etc., etc. Now, we all know that the possibility of deep disposal is there, but it's actually going nowhere at the moment. And in any case, even if we do find a place to put a repository, and if we do agree that that is the way to manage it, it is not going to happen for a long time. And therefore, my argument would be the problem is here and now, and the solution is here and now for the next 2-3 generations at least. And so what the hell are we doing thinking about new nuclear power stations, which would bring new wastes, spent fuel, onto sites around our country, like Bradwell, which I've been campaigning against, low on sea level, very, very vulnerable sites, and stuff being stored. We don't know what we would do with it, and it is left to people in the next century and beyond to somehow manage it in increasing deteriorating circumstances. We don't need nuclear power. Therefore, it is unnecessary to build these new nuclear stations. And my final argument would be that a legacy is about to be left, if we go forward with this, of a dangerous, unknowable, uncertain, and unpredictable nature. It's a moral issue of big dimensions, and one which I hope will come to the forefront of debates about nuclear power in the future.
Thanks very much indeed, Andy. We've now got a very short time for questions from the audience. I'm going to take as many questions as possible. I hope there could be succinct ones, and then I'll come back to the panel for a couple of minutes each at the end of the session, but I'm afraid we've got a very short time for this. Friend there with your hand up at the back, lady.
Right. What about the problem in terms of renewables of variation between winter and summer? Because that's the argument that's often put in favour of why we need nuclear.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I see David here down in the front row? Please come.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about one part of what Andy Blowers just raised, which is the terrorist implications of nuclear power. We've seen in the last 2 weeks, 22 people died in a terrorist incident in Manchester, and a dozen died in two terrorist incidents in London. And just this week, we've seen possibly over 100 people being killed in an accident in a tower block a few miles from here. If we were to have a terrorist incident involving a nuclear power plant or nuclear materials in transit, we wouldn't be talking about dozens or hundreds, we'd be talking about tens of thousands. And decades, if not centuries, of areas being completely unusable because of radioactive contamination. So I wonder whether or not some of the panelists could talk about this real issue, which is never discussed in the press, very rarely even discussed amongst anti-nuclear activists, but in my view, the most important problem with nuclear energy.
Thanks very much. I've got 3 hands there on the right. There's a woman there with her hand up, and then a man in front of her, and then a man on the side bench there. So that clump. Thank you.
Hello, it's quite right. We've been sort of bombarded with nuclear as a solution to climate change, and that we shouldn't have new coal power stations. But in Cumbria, it looks like we're going to have, we've got the plan for Mousseau, which is 3 AP1000 reactors, and 5 miles from Sellafield, and even nearer to the Mousseau plant, there's a plan for the first coal mine in England to be opened. What do the panel think about that, and how can we stop it? Because all the politicians want it.
Okay. Thanks, and the gentleman in front of her there. Yep.
Thanks very much. Yes, I think Dave knows what I'm going to say. I'm going to take issue with his view of the Labour policy. I think it was small c conservative. I was very fortunate just before the election was announced to get the chance to brief Alan Whitehead about my work with the Combi Craftwork people that showed that had it not been for the cuts, we could have had an all-renewable electricity supply by 2025 if we'd carried on at the same rate that your efforts with the FIT had generated. So, so what we're going to do now in the presence of the FIT, can I draw attention to thanks very much, Kate and Ian, for allowing me to do this. I've got a poster on what we can do locally to keep that sort of expansion going and to help us hit that target anyway by local initiatives and the nuclear-free local authorities that support that particular issue.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there on the bench, and then we'll come over to this
Hi.
side.
My name's Peter Roach. I run a website called notonuclearpower.org.uk, and I'm also press officer for Stop Hinkley. It's become clear this week that we can't even trust the government to keep us safe in our own houses. Are we really going to trust them to get away with building Hinkley Point C?
Thanks very much, and then we'll just take, there's 2 or 3 hands here.
Yeah, it's a couple of questions, but it's also a point of information. We've seen some interesting information about the spread of the flumes of nuclear radiation following Chernobyl and Fukushima. But I was in Africa when Chernobyl exploded. I was working for the UN on a site where UNEP, which hasn't been mentioned, the United Nations Environment Programme, has its headquarters, and it was monitoring, just as part of its regular work, nuclear background levels, because that was one of the things it did. It took 3 weeks for the nuclear spike to arrive from Chernobyl in Nairobi, and it wasn't linked to rainfall. So just throw that into the mix. My question is, as I look at the increasing costs of Hinkley, and I look at where the technology is coming from, it's being developed by EDF and Areva in Flamanville in Brittany. They are on their 3rd attempt to get the welding right on their pressure vessels. They are now a decade over schedule. They are, I don't know how many times over budget. If we apply that to the cost that we've been told so far of Hinkley and projected into the future, I think it would probably gobble up the whole of the country's economy. And I'd like to know how we can be getting information about that across. And the other thing is, I spend a lot of time in Denmark where some islands have been competing and now produce 110, 120% of their electricity requirements entirely from renewables. How do we publicize that in colder, less sunny climates, it's already happening, and we could be doing it too?
Thanks very much, yes, gentleman there. And there'll be only one more after you.
Thank you. My question is that the pro-nuclear advocates are getting very good at saying Chernobyl killed very few people, and therefore the non-linear no-threshold model, the linear no-threshold model must be wrong. Because otherwise epidemiological studies would have shown a large number of casualties from Chernobyl. But, so what's the answer to that? Because,
Okay, thanks. And then Caroline, the lady there in the grey, and then that's it, I'm afraid, for this session. There'll be other opportunities after.
Hello, I'm Caroline Gilbert from the Christian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and of course we're very interested in morals. So I was very interested to hear somebody mentioning the moral implication. And I've also just read from Ray Atchison from the Nuclear Ban Treaty in New York, which is happening now. I mean, it started on Thursday. And she says, Indigenous and women's rights took centre stage on the opening day of the Nuclear Ban Treaty on Thursday. Sounds familiar? No, that's probably because you've used all those other multinational nuclear weapon meetings where a lot of white men talk about how nuclear weapons afford security and stability, as if security and stability had nothing to do with the lived experience of human beings who have suffered from the production, testing, and use of nuclear weapons. So I think that certainly in this treaty, for the first time,
Caroline,
victims are actually
can you make it about nuclear? Okay, good, you finished. Right. Okay, thank you. Important point, but okay. So now coming back to the panel to answer any aspect of those questions they like in 2 minutes each. I'll go in reverse order. Ian.
Many of the points that you've raised are, all of them in fact, are valid and important. The thing about nuclear power is that it covers just about everything. And in a conference like this, one-day conference, we had to pick the highlights. However, it may well be that next year we'll have another conference, and that would be nice. And we can pick up many of the topics that that was not covered today, and I do understand and accept that. One technical aspect. For the gentleman in the blue about the UNEP program in Nairobi, Nairobi is south of the equator, and the explosion for Chernobyl happened north of the equator, and effectively there are two different weather systems separated by, roughly speaking, the equator. So the radioactive plumes and fallouts went right round the world in the northern hemisphere and took quite a while to transfer to the southern. There's not much interchange between the north and the south hemispheres. But I'll let other people answer things.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ian. David?
Well, I can't cover all of these questions. I dare say there's not much market left for coal and it's declining, so I don't know why anybody's considering coal mining now. As far as balancing variable renewables are concerned, there are many ways you can do this. I would say that nuclear power reduces the flexibility of the electricity system because it is inflexible, at least on economic, if not technological grounds, and it, as far as I'm aware, the only large-scale blackouts that have occurred, apart from the normal rural ones that you get when power lines collapse, that have occurred in this country have been through nuclear power stations like Hudson B in Scotland and Sizewell B in England breaking down, which led to hundreds of thousands of people being disconnected. So they're not very effective, and they're particularly bad at balancing variable renewables because the more nuclear you have online, the less you're able actually to integrate renewables without wasting some of it. I would point out one particular new tech thing which might appeal to some people. You can help reduce the cost of batteries by having them installed in your home. That might be a bit pricey for some people. If you need to use a car, you're not always walking around or bicycling, well, you can buy an electric car. And electric cars are going to be a very good way of balancing renewables because you can charge them when there's a lot of renewables around, and then you can use them as a store when there's not so much. So we need to concentrate on building a flexible, decentralized electricity system to use more renewables more efficiently. That would be my answer to all this. And of course, reduce electricity demand in general by having some competition to provide energy efficiency. They all compete on price now. Why not set a price and make the companies compete to provide energy efficient fridges and washing machines and things?
Okay,
Well, on the question of nuclear versus renewables and the problem of intermittency, a lot more will be said, I'm sure, about this later. My understanding is that we're getting to the point when the whole question of base load can be solved in various ways, partly through distributed systems, partly through a variety of alternatives and so on. But the point I want to make really here is that what makes you think that nuclear is so secure? I mean, if you have an accident like we did at Fukushima, the whole lot goes off the system. I mean, and we're in a situation where that could happen at any time. Nuclear is actually far less secure, and in a sense, you could argue that it is unpredictable and intermittent. So to see that as a solution for baseload supply, even though the need for baseload supply is diminishing rapidly, seems to me very foolish. On the terrorist question that David Lowry raised and which I alluded to, of course, nuclear power stations are quite possibly targets for terrorist intervention, although how terrorists operate, of course, is varied. One of the dangers, I think, is potentially having Chinese investment into power stations like Bradwell. That raises, I think, there is an issue here that China is not actually a necessarily friendly power towards the UK, and you could foresee circumstances in which a hostile position is there and the Chinese ability to penetrate our systems is much enhanced. And I think we should not just wish that one away simply because we are delighted with the idea of Chinese money pouring in to build these obscene stations. On the moorside question, the only thing I'd say about that is, the incredible thing about moorside is it's probably the only place where there is almost overwhelming local support, apparently, for that. That is because you are right on the Sellafield system, and it is seen as a way of perpetuating Sellafield through new developments and so on. The chances of it being built seem to me to be somewhat fragile at the moment because of the problems with the investment and various other problems that are there. And the last point I'd make is from when Pete Roach, I think, difficult to hear up here, but I think he was saying something about government and can we trust them, etc. The problem at the moment is that the government has absolutely no idea of where it's going to go on anything at all. No, this is serious. This country is in an incredible mess. I don't know how much you realize this, but you know, wherever you look now, everything seems to be really bad. And it has absolutely no idea about energy policy. It doesn't even want an energy policy. And yet we all know the current energy policy is ridiculous, nuclear is ridiculous. We all know that, it is a no-brainer. At some point, it seems to me, it's going to happen, and everybody recognizes this. But I don't know how long it's going to take before that actually happens.
Thanks very much. Final word to Tim.
I'll keep it short. UNEP, you know, I don't know, where has UNEP been? You know, they've never contacted me. They haven't, you know, so it was kind of a surprise to me that that basically IAEA was in charge of all of the biology associated with radiation and UNEP was never involved in any significant way. I'd love to hear from UNEP. LNT, linear non-threshold sort of biological thing. There's all of the data basically comes down in support of this notion of a linear no threshold. Basically, a little bit of extra radiation is slightly bad for you. A lot of extra radiation is much more bad for you, or the organism, the bird, whatever. And there's really no evidence of any kind of threshold below which it doesn't add additional risk. All of the published evidence, as summarized to date, supports that idea. So if you hear anything else, be very, very skeptical. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and of course a big thank you to all our speakers. So we now have a 15-minute break.